Empire had conquered 17 star systems without losing a single warship. Their technology was advanced beyond measure. Their weapons could melt entire cities in seconds. Their shields could stop any projectile known to the galaxy. When their supreme commander looked at the small blue planet called Earth, he saw nothing but easy prey. The humans had only recently discovered space travel. Their weapons were primitive. Their ships were slow. Victory would take perhaps 3 planetary rotations at most. Stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, watching Earth grow larger on the viewing screen. Behind him stretched a fleet of 2,000 warships. Each vessel carried enough firepower to destroy a continent. They had studied humanity for several cycles. They knew about human wars, human weaknesses, and human divisions. They knew that humans fought among themselves constantly. Surely such a species would crumble at the first sign of true power. The invasion began on a calm Tuesday morning. Ships descended through the clouds over every major city on Earth. They broadcast a simple message in every human language: surrender immediately or face complete destruction. The humans had 12 hours to respond. What happened next confused the commanders completely. Instead of panic, instead of immediate surrender, something strange occurred. Old enemies shook hands. Nations that had been rivals for centuries suddenly stood together. Within 6 hours, a unified human response came back to the fleet. The message was short. It contained only 2 words: "Come try." Laughed when he heard the response. He ordered the attack to begin immediately. There was no need to wait for the deadline. These primitive creatures needed to learn their place in the galaxy. The first wave of ground forces landed near the major cities. 10 million soldiers in advanced battle armor marched toward human population centers. They expected crying civilians and surrendering soldiers. What they found was something entirely different. In the ruins of what had been a shopping center in Chicago, a patrol walked confidently through the debris. Their scanners showed no human life signs. Then the ground beneath them exploded. Humans emerged from hidden tunnels, from beneath collapsed buildings, from places the technology had not detected. They fought with everything they had: guns, knives, improvised explosives, even their bare hands. A soldier named watched in horror as a human woman, clearly wounded and bleeding, tackled one of his. She should have been dead from her injuries. Instead, she fought with desperate strength, screaming words did not understand. His translator later told him she had been shouting her children's names. The won that first battle, of course. Their technology was simply too advanced, but they lost soldiers. For the first time in the history of their empire, they actually lost soldiers to a primitive species, and the humans who died took many with them. Reports from across the planet began flooding into the Eternal Dominion. Everywhere, the story was the same. Humans refused to surrender. Old men who could barely walk picked up weapons. Children as young as 12 ran messages between resistance groups. Scientists worked day and night to find weaknesses in technology. Farmers turned their fields into traps. Factory workers built weapons from spare parts. In Moscow, a group of retired soldiers held a bridge for 18 hours against overwhelming forces. They knew they would die. They held anyway. In Tokyo, office workers organized a resistance network that mapped every patrol route. In Cairo, university students figured out how to jam certain communication frequencies. Doctors worked in hidden hospitals, saving wounded fighters so they could return to battle. Could not understand what he was seeing. His species had evolved to survive by avoiding conflict. When faced with a superior enemy, the logical choice was submission. That was how nature worked. The strong ruled, the weak served. But humans seemed to operate on different logic entirely. 3 months into the invasion, they controlled most major cities. Their flags flew over government buildings. Their soldiers patrolled the streets. On paper, they were winning. But the reality was different. Soldiers could not walk anywhere alone without disappearing. Supply lines were constantly attacked. Equipment was stolen or sabotaged. Every night, explosions echoed through occupied territories. The human resistance was not one organization but thousands. There was no central command to destroy, no leader to capture. When one cell was eliminated, two more appeared. Humans communicated through methods that could not trace. Written messages passed hand to hand, code words hidden in ordinary conversation, secret signs left on walls and buildings. Commander summoned his advisors for an emergency meeting. The casualties were becoming unacceptable. For every 1,000 humans they killed, 2,000 more seemed to appear. Where were they coming from? How could a species that had been fighting itself for centuries suddenly unite so completely? A scientist named presented his research findings. He had been studying human biology and psychology. What he discovered disturbed everyone in the room. Human bodies produced chemicals during extreme stress that actually enhanced their performance. When frightened, they became stronger and faster. When protecting their loved ones, they could ignore pain that would disable any. Their brains were wired to resist hopelessness. They could believe in victory even when victory was mathematically impossible. But there was something else, something that they found almost impossible to comprehend. Humans had a concept they called sacrifice. They would willingly die to save others, not just their own children or family, but complete strangers. They would give their lives for ideas, for beliefs, for the mere possibility that future generations might be free. In the 4th month of occupation, a human mechanic named changed the course of the war. Working in a hidden underground workshop, she figured out how to modify human missiles to penetrate shields. The technology was crude. It required someone to manually guide the missile to its target. It was essentially a suicide weapon. Asked for volunteers. 300 people stepped forward within a day. The first attack came on a Thursday night. A single human aircraft, barely held together with tape and hope, flew toward a command ship. Every defensive system targeted it. The pilot, a former taxi driver named Johnson, died when his plane was hit by 17 different weapons simultaneously. But the missile he launched kept going. It struck the command ship's shield, punched through, and detonated inside the reactor. The explosion lit up the sky over 4 continents. Humans everywhere saw the ship fall burning from the heavens. For the first time, they had drawn real blood. The war was no longer hopeless. More attacks followed. Ships that had seemed invincible began falling from the sky. Each attack cost human lives. Each pilot knew they would not return, and still they volunteered. There was a waiting list. People argued for the chance to sacrifice themselves. Found himself unable to sleep. In his quarters, he reviewed footage of the human attacks over and over. He saw pilots smiling as they flew towards certain death. He saw ground fighters charging superior forces while laughing. He saw a human soldier, shot 7 times, crawling toward a position to throw one final grenade. What kind of species was this? 6 months into the invasion, they had lost 400 warships, their casualties numbered in the millions. Supply convoys refused to come to Earth without massive escorts. Soldiers who had once been eager for glory now requested transfers to any other system. The humans had not won. They were still outmatched, still dying in greater numbers, but they would not stop fighting. A captured human resistance leader was brought before for interrogation. She was elderly, perhaps 70 years old by human counting. Her name was, and she had been a schoolteacher before the invasion. Now she led a resistance cell that had destroyed 30 vehicles. Asked her why. Why did humans keep fighting when the logical choice was surrender? Why did they accept death so readily? Why did they not simply submit and save themselves? Smiled at him. She told him that humans had faced extinction before. They had survived ice ages, plagues, and their own foolishness. They had climbed out of caves and reached for the stars. Their history was written in the blood of those who refused to give up. Surrender was not in their nature. It had been burned out of their species over millions of years of struggle. She told something he would never forget. Humans did not fight because they thought they would win. They fought because fighting was who they were. Every generation inherited the spirit of every generation before. When children were taught to avoid conflict, human children were taught that some things were worth dying for: freedom, family, the future. The Supreme Council of the Empire recalled Commander after 9 months of failed occupation. The cost had become too high. Other conquered species were watching. They were seeing that the mighty could be hurt. Rebellions were beginning to spark in distant systems. On the day from Earth, humans gathered in the streets of their ruined cities. They had lost millions. Their infrastructure was destroyed. Their economies were shattered. By any reasonable measure, they had been defeated, but they were still standing. They were still free, and they were already rebuilding. Watched from orbit as his fleet prepared to leave. Down on the planet's surface, he could see humans waving at the sky, not in surrender, in defiance, in victory. They had paid a terrible price, but they had proven something to the entire galaxy. Humanity would not break. The Empire never attacked Earth again. Other empires heard the story and decided that perhaps the small blue planet was best left alone. Humans were too costly to conquer. Their resistance was not strategic. It was not calculated. It came from something deeper, something the galaxy had never encountered before. In the years that followed, humanity rebuilt and reached out to the stars with new determination. They had learned something about themselves during the invasion. They had learned that when everything was taken away, when hope seemed lost, when death was certain, they did not surrender. They did not break. They stood together and fought until their last breath. They had expected an easy victory. They found instead a species that turned defeat into defiance, that found strength in suffering, and that simply refused to accept the impossible. They found human resilience, and they learned that some walls cannot be broken, some spirits cannot be crushed, and some species will never ever give up. Earth became known across the galaxy as the world that could not be conquered, and whenever other species faced their own dark times, they remembered the humans. They remembered that sometimes the smallest, weakest, most primitive species could stand against the strongest empires and refuse to fall. That was the lesson of Earth. That was the legacy of humanity. That was what the invaders learned when they came expecting easy victory and found instead a resilience that was truly unbreakable.